Imagine a grand castle on a misty morning. The halls are quiet. The staff moves softly, speaking in whispers. A king lies in his bed, his heart weak, his future uncertain. Outside, the world waits for news. But inside, a family is torn apart by secrets, by fear, and by a king who refused to admit he was dying. This is a story about a king who tried to hide his illness, about a son who discovered the truth too late, and about a sister who refused to let him destroy himself. It all started with a collapse. King Charles suffered what the palace described as an acute cardiac episode after a private briefing. He collapsed without any warning and required emergency treatment. Doctors found cardiovascular complications serious enough to suspend every royal duty indefinitely. Those duties include approving state business, meeting government officials, and signing off on diplomatic correspondence. Suddenly, none of it could flow through the king. Prince William stood at a lectern inside Windsor Castle and delivered the grim news. He kept both hands pressed against the wood while Princess Anne stood beside him, holding a handkerchief she never once raised. The image alone told you this was not a routine health update. William paused during the statement and said, "My father," in a way that made it clear he was fighting to keep his voice controlled. Anne, who has spent decades being the most unflappable member of that family, looked completely devastated. But here is where the timeline starts to unravel. William confirmed that the king had lost consciousness and remained unresponsive during critical minutes. Specialists stabilized him, but recovery would be prolonged and uncertain. What makes it more complicated is that Anne later disclosed that Charles had been suffering breathlessness, dizziness, and chest pressure for weeks before the collapse. Weeks, not days. The king had dismissed every warning as fatigue. He had even laughed when Anne urged him to rest. That detail changes the entire narrative because it means the palace was not caught off guard by a sudden medical emergency. They were managing a deteriorating situation while publicly insisting everything was fine. 3 weeks before William and Anne stood in front of the cameras, King Charles was inside St. George's Hall rehearsing an investiture. That is the formal ceremony where the monarch presents honors to members of the public. Halfway through the procession, his right hand tightened around the back of a chair. His face lost its color. For 11 seconds, he could not answer when Princess Anne called his name. 11 seconds of silence while the king gripped a chair and struggled to respond to his own sister. The ceremony was stopped immediately. The doors were closed, and every witness was instructed to describe the interruption as a scheduling delay, not a medical incident. A scheduling delay. Anne reached Charles before anyone else, caught his arm as he struggled to breathe, and ordered the rehearsal stopped. The king refused an ambulance. His sister threatened to end the entire event unless he agreed to be examined nearby. He finally gave in. A palace physician recommended immediate rest and urgent heart testing. Charles nodded, signed a reduced schedule, and promised to follow the advice. Then within days, he began placing official meetings back onto the calendar. He believed stepping away would create panic, and believed he was gambling with his life. The argument that followed happened without any aides present. Anne told her brother that courage had become recklessness. He replied that the monarchy could not pause simply because its sovereign felt weak. She struck the chair beside her and said duty did not give him the right to force his family to watch a preventable collapse. Charles turned away, but he did not deny the danger. That confrontation matters because it proves the family knew the situation was escalating. And yet the incident never appeared in the general royal briefing notes, the daily summaries used to keep senior family members informed. Charles had ordered staff not to alarm William during what he called a demanding period. So the heir to the throne was deliberately kept in the dark about his father's deteriorating heart condition, while simultaneously being expected to step into the role the moment everything fell apart. Instead of feeling protected, William felt betrayed. The palace chose to frame this as protecting the heir rather than withholding critical medical information from the person who would need to take over at a moment's notice. That is the kind of logic that only makes sense inside an institution that has spent centuries prioritizing appearance over transparency. Then another warning emerged. A documented account from a footman stated that Charles became dizzy after a private dinner and had to steady himself against a corridor wall. The king dismissed the concern and ordered that no report be circulated. Queen Camilla had known about the first episode at the investiture rehearsal. She had urged him to rest, but she later supported his demand for secrecy. William now viewed her silence as part of the danger. Anne viewed it as proof that fear had overruled judgment. That is a significant fracture because it means the two people now tasked with holding the monarchy together were looking at the queen consort and seeing someone who enabled a cover-up rather than someone who protected the king. Camilla found herself in an impossible position. caught between loyalty to her husband's wishes and the reality that those wishes were actively endangering his life. But supporting the decision to hide symptoms from the heir and the Princess Royal was never going to look like anything other than complicity once the truth came out. When a physician later asked to speak privately with the king's children, Camilla watched the door close between them. She was his wife, yet suddenly she stood outside the circle deciding what came next. That moment cut deeper than protocol. It exposed the fundamental tension between the private family and the public institution. It showed that when the crisis became severe enough, even a queen consort could be sidelined in favor of the bloodline. William eventually opened the royal engagement diary in his father's study and found cancelled medical appointments replaced by official meetings. He closed the book and asked who authorized the changes. The private secretary answered simply, "The king." That detail is devastating because it confirms Charles was not being mismanaged by staff or misled by advisors. He was actively overriding medical advice and hiding the evidence from his own family. William carried the file toward the medical suite, with Anne joining him at the door. For weeks, Charles had used his authority as sovereign to protect his secret. Now William and Anne were about to use love, anger, and constitutional necessity to strip that secret away. The confrontation that followed was not a polite family discussion. William placed the medical file beside the bed and asked one question. "Why did you decide we had no right to know?" Charles looked exhausted, but his instinct to control the room remained intact. A heart monitor tracked his condition beneath his sleeve, yet he still asked why the confidential file had left the medical office. The king insisted the crisis was being handled. William did not move. He explained that government briefings, diplomatic correspondence, and palace authorizations were already reaching him. Those authorizations are the official approvals needed to keep royal and state duties moving. He could not protect the institution while being denied the truth about the man at its center. His anger finally broke through. The prince accused his father of treating love like a weakness that had to be managed. Charles fired back that an heir could not be burdened with every private fear. His son answered immediately. He was not speaking as the heir. He was speaking as a child who had nearly learned the truth too late. That line shifts the entire dynamic because it reframes the conflict not as a constitutional crisis between a monarch and his successor, but as a family intervention where the son is confronting the father about choices that could have left him grieving without any warning. Anne refused to soften the moment. She reminded Charles of the investiture rehearsal and the promise he had made to rest. She told him that continuing had not shown courage. It had forced everyone around him to participate in denial. Her voice stayed steady until the final sentence. "You made us help you disappear in front of us." Charles finally stopped arguing. The monarch admitted that stepping back frightened him more than the symptoms. He believed that once William carried the full burden, the country might discover how easily the crown could function without him. That admission is remarkably honest and also remarkably painful because it reveals that Charles was not just afraid of illness or death, he was afraid of irrelevance. He had waited his entire life to become king, and the thought of proving that the institution did not actually need him was more terrifying than the physical symptoms he was hiding. William opened the specialist report and read the conclusion aloud. Even if Charles stabilized, returning to his previous workload could trigger another catastrophic episode. The king closed his eyes. That silence confirmed he already knew. Before sunrise, the red dispatch boxes stopped traveling to the king's private suite. They were redirected to Prince William. No proclamation had been made. No crown had changed hands. Charles remained sovereign, but inside Windsor, the machinery of monarchy had already shifted. Anne stood beside the long table as advisors placed schedules, security briefings, and government papers before her nephew. William did not sit in his father's chair. He chose the one beside it. A gesture of loyalty that also revealed the painful truth that the transition was happening whether anyone wanted it or not. The crown's emergency arrangement allowed senior royals to act for the monarch without removing him from the throne. William took control of high-level briefings, public engagements, and urgent communication with government officials. Anne managed the household, staff discipline, travel plans, and the cancellation of duties that might place further pressure on Charles. The first meeting exposed the emotional cost. Immediately, an aide pulled out the king's chair, but William stopped him and made his position clear. No one would behave as though his father had already disappeared. The decision earned silent respect, yet it also revealed how deeply the future king feared the meaning of every royal gesture. He understood that symbolism matters in that family, and sitting in the king's chair while Charles was still alive would send a message he was not willing to send. Camilla entered before the meeting could begin and demanded to know why Anne had approved changes to the royal calendar without consulting her. The princess answered that Charles had requested stability, and stability now required decisions without emotional interference. Camilla heard more than procedure in those words. She heard an accusation that grief had weakened her judgment. She reminded the princess that she understood her husband better than anyone. Anne replied that understanding him had not stopped the crisis. Then the private secretary produced a recorded instruction dictated by Charles. After the confrontation, the king granted William authority over external royal duties and asked Anne to supervise the household until doctors decided whether he could return. He also directed them to lead every public health communication. Camilla froze. She had expected to speak for her husband, but the monarch had chosen his son and sister instead. The decision was not punishment. Charles believed they would project the unity the country needed. Still, the queen experienced it as rejection. Anne removed a small key from a black leather case and placed it in William's palm. It opened the dispatch boxes used for urgent state papers. She closed his fingers around it and said, "You are not taking his place. You are holding it for him." William could not answer. An aide then entered with a message from the doctors. Charles had suffered another brief heart rhythm disturbance during the night. By morning, the crown had adapted. But inside the family, the second warning shattered the last hope that life could quickly return to normal. That second warning lasted less than a minute, but its effect traveled through every royal residence. Engagements disappeared from calendars. Cars waiting in palace courtyards were dismissed. Staff members were told to prepare for weeks of uncertainty. At Windsor, Queen Camilla stood outside Charles's room as doctors adjusted the monitors and refused to let anyone enter. At Kensington Palace, William read the update twice before folding it into his pocket and telling Catherine, "This is no longer temporary." The prince immediately inherited the most sensitive royal duties, taking control of government meetings, diplomatic calls, and urgent public engagements. State visits, investitures, and receptions were postponed or reassigned. Removing Charles from the investiture role alone signaled how serious the crisis had become, because that ceremony is one of the most visible duties the monarch performs. Edward and Sophie were also asked to increase their workload, because the monarchy could not simply stop. Windsor tightened every rule. The private wing was placed under strict access control, and a medical response team remained nearby at all times. Only a small group of relatives could see the king, and every visit was limited. The reason was clear. Even brief emotional strain could place more pressure on his heart. Camilla refused to accept those limits. When a physician asked her to leave during treatment, the queen stood her ground and said she was his wife, not a visitor. Anne approached and guided her toward the corridor. The princess told her that love did not cancel medical orders. Camilla pulled her arm away, but she still stepped back. William faced an even harder duty at home. He and Catherine gathered George, Charlotte, and Louis and explained that their grandfather's heart had become dangerously weak. George asked whether this meant his father would become king. The question stopped William. The future king finally answered, "It means grandfather needs us to be a family first." That moment captures the impossible position this crisis created. A child asked the most direct question possible, and his father had to answer without lying while also not accelerating a transition that was already painful enough. Specialists later confirmed through a written medical assessment that recovery could take months. Even a favorable outcome would require rehabilitation, reduced stress, and permanent changes to Charles's role. A full return was quietly removed from palace planning. Then a private recording surfaced. Charles had dictated it before the second disturbance. In the audio, the monarch thanked Anne for protecting him from his own stubbornness and told William that leadership begins when fear no longer controls duty. Camilla listened alone. When Charles apologized for shutting her out, she stopped the recording and covered her face. Hours later, the king sent a handwritten request through his physician. He wanted William and Anne together. No advisors, no papers, no witnesses. The crisis had stripped away titles and barriers. Now Charles wanted one final conversation with the two people carrying both his family and his crown. There were no private secretaries in the room when William and Anne returned. No doctors stood close enough to hear. Charles had asked for the curtains to be opened, and pale morning light stretched across the floor beside his bed. For once the king did not begin with instructions. He looked at his son, then at his sister, and admitted that he had spent years believing duty meant never allowing anyone to see him afraid. "I was wrong," he said, "and it nearly cost me everything." Charles accepted what he had resisted for weeks. Even recovery would not restore the old pattern of endless ceremonies, meetings, and travel. The monarch could still offer counsel and constitutional continuity, meaning he would remain the legal head of state and guide major decisions, but the visible burden had to move toward William whether the family felt ready or not. Anne listened without interrupting. The king asked his sister to remain beside his son during the transition because she possessed the honesty he had often rejected and William would soon need. The princess promised to serve the crown, but she made one thing clear. Before titles, procedure, and duty, she was still his sister. William refused to let the moment become a farewell. When Charles began speaking as though his reign had already ended, the prince stopped him. He would accept responsibility, but he would not turn a medical crisis into a funeral before death had occurred. His anger no longer came from betrayal, it came from hope. Charles finally apologized for the deception. The monarch admitted that he had hidden his symptoms because William's readiness frightened him. Watching his son succeed would have filled him with pride, but it would also have proved that the crown no longer depended on him. William answered quietly, "Being needed and being loved are not the same thing." The words broke something open between them. Charles agreed to authorize a long-term transfer of major public duties while retaining the throne during recovery. The arrangement would prevent the monarchy from being trapped between denial and sudden succession. Anne received one final responsibility. The king asked her to stop palace factions from turning his illness into a struggle between William and Camilla. She accepted, but warned that peace would require boundaries, honesty, and decisions some relatives would hate. Charles extended his hand toward William and placed hers beneath her brother's wrist to support it, and the prince closed both hands around them. No oath was spoken, yet the promise was clear. The king would stop pretending. The heir would stop fearing responsibility. The sister would hold them together. By afternoon, the long walk outside Windsor Castle was no longer empty. Families arrived carrying flowers. Veterans stood silently beneath regimental umbrellas. A handwritten sign rested against the gate. "You served us, now let them care for you." Across Britain, broadcasters abandoned normal schedules as the image of William and Anne's announcement played repeatedly. Yet one newspaper front page captured the national mood more powerfully than any speech. A photograph of Charles smiling beside the words, "The King must rest." The palace released its second statement before the evening broadcast began. Charles would remain under specialist supervision and permanently reduce his workload. William would carry the main public and constitutional burden, meaning the formal duties required to keep the crown connected to government and national life. Anne and other senior working royals would support him. The words avoided abdication, but they confirmed that the old routine was over. Broadcasters quickly changed their tone. The debate moved away from succession and toward the human cost of duty. Commentators described the crisis as the moment the king finally accepted that service did not require destroying himself. Charles had spent years appearing dependable. Now the country was being asked to accept his weakness without seeing it as failure. Public sympathy carried its own tension. Some feared the illness marked the end of an era. Others welcomed William's growing leadership but felt uneasy discussing the future while his father was still fighting to recover. Hope and grief stood side by side, and neither could silence the other. Camilla faced that emotion directly. During the family appearance, the Queen kept her eyes ahead until a journalist called out a question about Charles. She stopped, turned back, and said, "He knows the country is beside him." Her voice cracked on the final word. William placed a steady hand near her arm and guided her inside. Charles watched the gathering through a live television feed beside his bed. The king saw the flowers, the handwritten messages, and the growing crowd beyond the gates. When people began singing the national anthem, he asked for the sound to be increased. He said nothing, but tears gathered in his eyes. William rejected any image that made the transition look like a victory. Palace staff proposed releasing a formal solo portrait of the prince to show continuity. He refused. Instead, he approved a family photograph with Charles seated, Camilla beside him, and Anne and William standing behind them. The message was clear. Responsibility had shifted, but the king had not been erased. At 6 in the evening, the long walk fell silent. A child placed one white rose near the gate. Then applause began and spread through the crowd. Late that evening, the palace announced a recorded address from Charles. The country had heard from the heir and the Princess Royal. Now it would hear from the man whose refusal to stop had brought the monarchy to the edge of irreversible loss. King Charles's recorded message lasted less than 4 minutes, but it ended the uncertainty that had gripped the monarchy. Seated beside a window at Windsor, he did not disguise his weakness or promise an impossible return. He thanked the medical team that saved him, the public that waited for him, and the family forced to carry a burden he had refused to release. Then he looked directly into the camera and said, "The crown is strongest when duty is shared, truth is spoken, and love is finally allowed to help." Charles confirmed that his public role would remain permanently reduced. The king would continue receiving constitutional briefings, meaning the essential government updates a monarch must review. But William would represent the crown at most major national and international engagements. The change was permanent. It did not remove his title, but it ended the old expectation that he had to carry everything alone. William's new position was equally clear. The prince was not replacing his father or waiting impatiently for the throne. He was becoming the active guardian of the reign, carrying its responsibilities while protecting Charles's dignity. Succession no longer felt like a contest between generations. It became an act of service. William entered after the recording and told Charles that the message sounded honest. The king asked whether that honesty had made him appear weak. His son answered, "No, it made you sound like my father." Charles smiled, and the bitterness that had divided them finally disappeared. Anne received the apology she never demanded. The monarch thanked his sister for refusing to protect his pride at the expense of his life. The princess answered that she would make the same choice again. Then she opened the curtains fully, ending the dim silence that had surrounded the crisis. Camilla also accepted the new reality. The queen no longer fought to control the health narrative or the palace response. She allowed William and Anne to lead the transition while she remained beside Charles during rehabilitation. Her role became quieter, but it also became more honest. She chose companionship over authority. The royal household changed with them. Duties would be shared earlier. Medical advice could no longer be ignored for appearances. Secrecy would no longer be mistaken for strength. Charles finally rose with assistance and took several careful steps toward the window. William stayed close without reaching for him. Anne watched from the doorway while Camilla waited beside the chair. The king looked toward the people beyond the gates and raised one hand. The crisis did not destroy his reign. It destroyed his belief that he had to suffer alone. William carried power without cruelty and proved that loyalty sometimes demands confrontation. Camilla learned that love can survive without control, and Charles discovered that releasing the burden did not weaken the crown. It saved the man beneath it. The monarchy endured not because its king appeared invincible, but because at the most dangerous moment of his life, his family finally allowed him to be human.